Should I submit this Batman Adventures number 12 to CGC under the modern tier? Or, since its fair market value might be more than $400, depending on the grade that it gets, should I instead spend the extra $60 and submit it under the high value tier? Well, in a minute, I'm going to tell you what I am planning to do and the pros and cons of that decision. But first, I just want to go through all the submission tiers to make sure that we are all familiar with them. So first up, we have the modern tier, which are for comics printed in 1975 or later, and which has a fair market value of $400 or less. And the fee for submitting a comic in this tier is $25. Now, secondly, we had the vintage tier, which is for comics printed before 1975 that also have a fair market value of $400 or less. And the fee for submitting a comic in this tier is $37. Next up, we have the high value tier, which is for comics from any era that has a fair market value between $400 and $1,000. And the fee for submitting a comic in this tier is $85. Now, they've recently redone all these tiers. They used to have another tier in between high value and unlimited value, but they realized they could make a little bit more money this way. So the final tier is unlimited value, and obviously it's what it sounds like. This is for any comic of any era whose fair market value is more than $1,000. And the fee for that item is 4% of the fair market value with a minimum of $150. And so you can tell right away that there is a huge difference in how much it costs to submit a comic depending on what tier you put it in. So what tier am I going to use when I submit this Batman Adventures number 12? Well, I tend to be pretty conservative in the value that I assign to the comics that I submit to CGC. So that means that I am going to be submitting this using the modern tier, which means that I am saying that I think the fair market value of this book is no more than $400. Now, I'm going to do that for a few reasons. First and most importantly, I don't want to spend an extra $60 to get this thing graded. I would much rather only pay $25 instead of the $85 that I would have to pay to submit this under the high value tier. Secondly, it's just really hard to determine the fair market value for a raw comic book because its condition is uncertain. Of course, that's why many of us send our books to get graded so that we can determine the condition for sure, at least according to a third party, and place an appropriate value on it. But while it's raw, I mean, looking at this book, it's certainly not a 9.8. And because of its flaws, I could see it getting as low as an 8.5, but I could also see it getting as high as a 9.4, and likely it will be somewhere in the middle of those. But that means there's a wide range of fair market values that I could assign to this book. So if it does end up being closer to the 8.5, well, $400 is probably about what it's worth. On the other hand, if it ends up being closer to the 9.4, then it's going to be well over that $400. But I would prefer to be conservative in my estimate once again so that I can pay only $25 instead of $85. Now, before we continue on, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, of course, I'd appreciate if you consider doing so now. Now, you might be asking, well, what if CGC disagrees? What if they get that Batman Adventures 12 number in and says, hey, this is clearly a 9.4 and it's definitely worth more than $400? What's going to happen? Well, this actually just happened to me on my most recent CGC submission when this Werewolf by Night number 32 came back at a 7.0. And CGC basically said, hey dude, this book is worth a little bit more than $400, but it's not a big deal at all. All that they did was simply send me an email notifying me that they were going to move this up to the high value tier and charge me the extra $60. However, I think CGC tends to be pretty lenient in how much they allow you to assign a conservative value to the comic books that you submit to them. So in that recent submission, these are some other books that I got back, and I'm pretty sure all of these have a fair market value over $400, but CGC still allowed me to keep them in the modern or vintage tier. Again, both of those tiers cap out at $400. And so we have another Werewolf by Night that came in as a 5.0. We have an Amazing Spider-Man number 129 that came back as a 3.5. We have one of my favorites, Tales to Astonish 93, that came back as a 9.0. And we have a Batman 251 that came back as a 7.0. Now, again, I could have submitted all of these under the high value tier saying, hey, I think these might be worth more than $400. But instead, I submitted them again under the modern tier or the vintage tier. And so that ended up saving me over $200. However, there is a little bit of risk to this because the value that you assign to your books is the limit of how much they will insure those books. So in other words, if they had lost or damaged this Tales to Astonish 93, which is worth about $1,000 in the 9.0 condition that it came back in, then I would have received at most $400 back. And so obviously that's a real risk. Now, I don't mind that risk for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm generally buying these books for under fair market value. So I actually got this book for just $100. So obviously this was a home run. And so even if CGC only gave me $400 back in response to it being damaged or lost, I would still have gotten my money back and then some. Now, of course, I'd prefer to get $1,000 back if they did that. But I really feel the risk of something happening to this book is really low, even though if you saw my last video, you know that ASM 129 does have some damage. But I think it more than balances out that the $200 that I saved on this submission will more than make up for the occasional loss. Because again, when you're talking dozens of books that you're saving $60 on, then you can take a couple of hits in damage and it not be that big of a deal. And of course, obviously, it's totally unlikely that they're just going to completely lose the book. It's more likely that they bend a corner and this drops from like a 9.0 to an 8.0. And then really the value that's lost is only like $100 anyway. And so I probably wouldn't get that $100 back. And so those are the reasons that this bad boy is going to get submitted to CGC under the modern tier, even though its fair market value could be above $400. Now, again, I only paid $300 for it. I got a good deal. I'm on the hunt, you know what I mean? And so I don't really lose a lot, even if they really screwed this book up. But tell me, what do you think about this strategy? Do you agree, or are there other factors that you consider when determining what tier to submit to CGC? Now, before I go, of course, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, I'd appreciate if you consider doing so. Like, comment, all those things that help us with that algorithm. Thanks for watching, and as always, I look forward to the next one.